substantial amount of time. So in a sense, they're like a draftee, and they lose. But the typical person gains. I became friends years ago with this man, Colonel, I probably shouldn't name him, this man, a colonel in the US Army, who became a colonel during the Vietnam War. I'm sure he's dead, but I probably shouldn't name him. Lived in San Francisco. And we were talking about the Vietnam War. And of course, I thought it was a pretty bad war. And I said, what'd you think? He said, oh, it was great. Oh, good. Why? It was great for my career. And that is a very narrow focus a lot of people in the military bring to it. And in fact, there was a famous saying back during the Vietnam War, because the military wasn't that gung-ho on it. They saw some of the problems of the Vietnam War. The saying was, well, it's not a great war, but it's the only war we have. And so it was good for them. Now let me name the third group, though, that I think in its influence is as, I don't think the military is that important as a pressure for this. Because there are mixed views. And by the way, I teach these students, and I love them. And I think they're good people. And so I don't think they're out there saying, hey, let's have a war. I'm just saying they're not going to be strongly against it with that inside. But there's a third group that doesn't get talked about a lot, that I think is a huge player in pushing for war. And that is the foreign policy establishment. The people who are making their livings analyzing these things, sitting in those Washington think tanks, those people you see when you turn on C-SPAN early in the morning Pacific time, and they're on panels and talking about all this stuff. And they're making somewhere between $80,000 and $150,000 a year talking about this. And I have a colleague at the Navy School, and again, I'm not going to name him for what will be an obvious reason, in the National Security Affairs part of the school, whose specialty is the Middle East. And a few years ago, I said, I'll call him X. X, how are you doing? Oh, great. How come? Oh, the Middle East is in turmoil. So I think those are some of the people who benefit. Now, I've talked about the budgetary cost of the war. I've talked about the oil cost of the war. Let me talk about another big cost of the war, and that's the loss to our freedom. Now, when you pay more taxes, that is a loss of freedom. So in a sense, I've already talked about it a bit, but I want to talk about other aspects. Who here has heard of an economist named Robert Higgs? Oh, good. He wrote a book called Crisis and Leviathan. I think it's one of the best books written in the 1980s. And he pointed out in it that every time the U.S. has gotten to a war, well, the two major times in the 20th century, First World War, Second World War, the government has taken on new powers over people's lives, and not all of those powers end when the war ends. So, for example, before the U.S. entered World War I, the top income tax rate was 15%. By 1918, the last year of the war, it had reached 77%. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon in the 1920s brought it down to 24%, but it never went down to 15%, and of course it's now higher than 24%. Similarly, an early form of prohibition started during World War I, and it was an unintended consequence of price controls. The government controlled the price on food, and that caused shortages of food. The government controlled the price on grain, that caused shortages of grain. So the government stepped in to ration, to allocate grain. Well, if the government officials are saying to themselves, if we're going to ration grain, can we really justify letting people use grain to make alcohol? So alcohol made from grain became illegal. And although the idea of a national police force, with its ominous implications for liberty, was anathema to the Founding Fathers, one outgrowth of World War I was an increase in the size and duties of a national police force called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For decades it was run by a power-hungry man, J. Edgar Hoover, who snooped on Martin Luther King, among others, and whom even the Wall Street Journal attacked for running roughshod over people's liberties. Also during World War I, President Wilson nationalized railroads, and when they were denationalized after the war, the railroads never had the same freedom of action they had before. World War II gave us a top tax rate of 94%, and it wasn't until 1964 the top rate fell to 70%. World War II also introduced income tax withholding. The chairman of Macy's was an advisor to the Treasury, and he said the way you get people to pay more money is do it on the installment plan. So let's take a little out of everyone's check every few weeks, and they're not going to notice it as much. And we've had withholding since then. Before then, you paid your taxes once a year. Paid the whole thing. And they knew people wouldn't save and pay a huge amount of money, so they wanted to take it bit by bit. Also, price controls were imposed nationally, and New York City's rent controls, imposed in 1942 as a temporary measure, are still with us today, as you know if you've seen some Seinfeld reruns. The current Bush war has also brought its, the current Bush-Obama war has also brought its share of freedom reduction, especially in the area of civil liberties, with the USA Patriot Act, NSA wiretaps of American citizens. So those who advocate liberty must take a serious look at the wars the U.S. government gets into and should cast just as skeptical an eye on those wars as they do on other government interventions. And this gets to the point that I made at the start of my talk. Libertarians, by definition, value freedom more than other people do. Moreover, we have a coherent story about how destructive various government interventions are to the domestic economy, and we can carry that story over to foreign policy. We should be the natural leaders of the anti-war movement. And many of us are, but many of us aren't. Why? Well, let me ask you a question, and probably the libertarians know this better than the others. Who here has heard of this thing called the world's smallest political quiz? Raise your hand. Okay, good. So roughly half the people. There are 10 or 20. I brought it along. 10 questions. What?
The smallest one is 10.
Yeah, 10. Okay, so there are 10 questions. How many questions on there are about foreign policy? 0. So you could, in the extreme, get someone who ranks perfect, total libertarian, and believes that the United States government should attack and bomb Canada without provocation. Right? There's nothing on there that says whether they should or shouldn't. That means to me there's something terribly wrong with that quiz. Libertarians have honed their principles and applied them to literally hundreds of domestic policy issues, and we've done a great job. The depth of our understanding of how to apply our principles to those issues and of the importance of peace in the domestic realm is truly something for us to be proud of. And we haven't given nearly the same care to examining foreign policy. And the way I like to put it is, I advocate that the U.S. government treat foreigners at least as well as it should treat us. So I think we should give that care to that issue. And I'll end by saying that I think what we'll find is the case for non-interventionist foreign policy is even stronger than the case for non-interventionist domestic policy, and we should be the leaders, so let's lead. We have a little time for question, Q&A. Sir?
How is your position different from pacifism?
Oh, very different, in 2 ways. I have a blog, which I probably should have mentioned. I gave him my bio and he was faithful to it, but I forgot to mention the blog, called Econ Law. And so a few of us have been talking about this. Brian Kaplan, who's a way more radical. Brian Kaplan makes me look like a stodgy old guy. I mean, not very libertarian by comparison. And Brian came on as a blogger recently and said he's a pacifist. And I'm not, so I kind of laid out the way I'm not. And there are 2 ways. There are 2 kinds of pacifism as I see it. What's your name?
Elliot?
Elliot. So Elliot, let's say you come up to me and you threaten to punch me in the face. And I see, and Brian pointed out when I raised this issue, probably my best strategy is to run. Which, by the way, has been a very good strategy. And the few times in my life when I didn't follow it, I regretted it. But let's say that I decide not to. And you're a credible threat. And I punch you back. To me, that means I'm not a pacifist. So, and I'm not. If that happened, Elliot, sorry, but I'll punch you back. Now, then the other one, and so it turns out Brian didn't mean that at all. He said, yeah, I agree. I could imagine situations like that. Where he draws the line is he doesn't want the government ever to make war. And whereas I think there's only been one war in the last 240 years of American history that I clearly favor, namely the Revolutionary War. I'm not sure about the War of 1812, and I'm not sure about World War II. Those are two tougher ones we can get into a long discussion about. World War I is just totally clear-cut. We could avoid it and done better. But anyway, a pacifist in Brian's sense would say the government should never make war. And I would say